Welcome to the Puzzle Proof, where mysteries begin. Every clue is a deception. Every answer leads to more questions. Only the sharpest minds will see the truth hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple and Shadows in the Vicarage. Chapter 1. A Dreary Invitation. Miss Jane Marple sighed softly as the country train pulled into a small, deserted platform in Devonshire. A chill October wind whipped her tidy grey curls beneath her snug hat, and the hem of her sensible tweed skirt fluttered against her ankles. She had journeyed from St. Mary Mead after receiving a rather urgent letter from her old acquaintance, the Reverend Timothy Linton. The tone of his note had been deeply troubling, breathless, imploring, and unlike the vicar's usual measured style. It spoke of strange goings-on and an unsettling atmosphere lingering over his quiet parish. Despite her fondness for home comforts, Miss Marple's curiosity had been well and truly piqued. A small hired car conveyed her through narrow, winding lanes. The land on either side appeared oddly bleak, with tall hedgerows looming like silent sentinels. Soon she caught sight of the vicarage, a sombre Georgian edifice, its facade weathered by centuries of damp Atlantic winds. Blackened ivy clung to the stone walls, and the window panes seemed to glare in disapproval at all who approached. Reverend Linton himself greeted Miss Marple at the door. The vicar, usually a man of gentle smiles and warm handshakes, appeared more careworn than she remembered. Lines of worry marked his brow, and his kindly eyes betrayed a certain dread. After guiding her into a stuffy drawing room lined with dusty theological tomes, he rang for tea. Mrs. Greeley, the housekeeper, brought in the tray with a rattling of porcelain. She set the pot and cups down on a low table near the hearth, her face drawn into a tight-lipped mask. Even before speaking, Miss Marple sensed that the household had been unsettled by something grim. Over a carefully poured cup of tea, Reverend Linton began his tale. "I'm so grateful you came, Miss Marple," he said, voice low. "We've had a tragedy here. Lord Petherbridge, a local landowner, was found dead under the most disturbing circumstances." He paused, fingers trembling slightly as he reached for a biscuit. "His body was discovered by the old crypt 2 nights ago. The police won't share much, but there's talk of, well, unnatural marks." Miss Marple, her expression gentle yet focused, waited for him to continue. She always believed in allowing people to speak freely, gleaning important details from their tone and posture as much as from their words. "I've also heard rumours," the vicar went on, lowering his voice, "of eerie chanting in the churchyard. At night, you understand. Some of my parishioners claim they've seen odd lights flickering among the gravestones. And now there are stories circulating, wild, impossible tales of curses and ghosts." He gave a shaky laugh, but his eyes shone with genuine fear. "I don't hold with superstition, Miss Marple, yet there's a dreadful heaviness in the air, as though something dark has settled over us." Miss Marple placed her teacup gently in its saucer. "I quite understand. Often when the unimaginable happens, people will conjure any explanation that eases their fear." She spoke in her usual soothing tone, though she felt her own curiosity stirring rapidly. A mysterious death, combined with talk of cryptic chanting, was enough to set any inquisitive mind racing. "But rest assured, Reverend," she added, "there is no puzzle so tangled that we cannot tease it out. If you're certain you want me here, I'll do whatever I can to help." The vicar nodded. "The inspector, a Mr. Harris, is here as well. He's a capable man, but somewhat dismissive of local law. Even so, he does seem troubled by the particulars of the death. Something about Lord Petherbridge's posture and the bruises around his neck." He paused, swallowing hard. "I shouldn't speak of such unpleasantness, but but perhaps your fresh eyes will find what we cannot see." Night soon fell, settling like a smothering blanket over the vicarage and the adjacent churchyard. Over dinner, Miss Marple gleaned a few more details. Lord Petherbridge's family history included whispered tales of curses, wayward ancestors, and hidden relics, gossip typical of old English families. Yet these murmurings took on a sinister hue against the reality of his recent demise. The vicar confided that the villagers were on edge, peering through their drawn curtains after dark, and jumping at every hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves. Retiring early to her modest guest chamber, Miss Marple reflected on the vicar's words. Shadows danced on the walls from the flicker of the bedside lamp. Though travel-weary, she could not easily sleep. A life had been taken in what seemed a most dreadful manner. The rustle of wind in the ivy outside, the soft creak of the old floorboards, every sound felt like a warning, hinting that something far darker than rumour lay waiting to be uncovered in this lonely corner of Devonshire. Chapter 2. A Sinister Discovery. Miss Marple rose early the following morning. Despite the relative unfamiliarity of her guest bedroom at the vicarage, she had snatched a few hours of sound sleep. One never quite forgot the lessons of age and experience, and Miss Marple knew that a good night's rest was essential for the clarity of mind required in delicate matters, especially one involving a violent death. When she drew aside the heavy curtains, a grey dawn greeted her. The drizzle that had set in overnight continued to murmur against the window panes, lending everything outside an uneasy hush. In the dim corridor, she found Reverend Linton already awake. "My dear Miss Marple, you're up early," he remarked, offering a wan smile. "I was rather hoping you would be, as Inspector Harris has asked us both to visit the churchyard. I believe he wants your impressions." There was a hint of apology in the vicar's voice, as though he still felt uneasy about involving her in such a grim matter. Miss Marple, however, replied simply, "I shall do my best to help, Reverend. Best to face these things in the bright light of day, though I must say it's rather gloomy out." Within the hour, the two had donned their coats, taken a brisk breakfast, and stepped out into the chill morning mist. The churchyard lay a short distance from the vicarage, an ancient graveyard flanked by tall yew trees. Miss Marple clasped her handbag a little tighter, conscious of how unnerving the atmosphere was. Inspector Harris, a broad-shouldered man in a dark overcoat, stood waiting near the church's south porch. He acknowledged them with a curt nod. "Glad you could come, Miss Marple," he said, brusquely, yet not unkindly. His breath hung in the cold air. "The station received a call at dawn. Someone claimed they saw lights out here again last night, but by the time my men arrived, there was no one about." Reverend Linton cleared his throat. "This has happened before, Inspector. In fact, I've had multiple parishioners mention odd flickers in the darkness. At first, I chalked it up to their imaginations, fears stirred by Lord Petherbridge's demise, but there might be more to it," Miss Marple finished gently, her eyes scanning the rows of headstones. Rain-soaked grass stretched between the markers, each carved with names dating back centuries. She noted that the oldest part of the cemetery, where Lord Petherbridge's body had been found, lay at the far boundary. A faint iron gate led to an old crypt, seldom used these days. The land sloped downward there, and even in the daytime, shadows persisted. Inspector Harris led the way, stepping carefully on the wet ground. Miss Marple observed how his posture stiffened as they approached the crypt, an austere stone structure half buried in the earth. Its entrance stood partly ajar, revealing a yawning darkness within. Two constables hovered nearby, exchanging uneasy looks. "Let's see if we can find any trace of last night's prowlers," Harris muttered. He beckoned one of the constables, who handed him a torch. With the press of a switch, a cone of light cut through the darkness inside the crypt. The inspector stepped in first, Miss Marple just behind him, and Reverend Linton following with furrowed brows. The interior was cramped, the walls damp and glistening where moss had taken hold. Rows of ancient tombs lined either side, each name barely legible in the gloom. As Miss Marple's eyes adjusted, she caught sight of something unusual on the floor, a waxy splash on the stone flags, perhaps from a melted candle. "Looks fresh," muttered Inspector Harris, stooping to inspect it. "We found similar wax droplets near the place where Lord Petherbridge's body was discovered." Miss Marple knelt, her movements careful, mindful not to disturb anything that could serve as evidence. "It might indicate some sort of nocturnal gathering," she ventured. "I recall hearing of such things in old folk tales, though I've never placed much stock in them. But sometimes misguided people turn to strange rites." She paused, the memory of her conversation with Reverend Linton the previous night returning to mind. Talk of chanting and ghostly shapes. It was enough to give a person goosebumps. As if on cue, one of the constables called out from the corner of the crypt. He had found a small wooden box tucked behind a half-collapsed tomb. The inspector took it carefully, shining his torch inside. The box contained half-burned tapers and a curious old medallion with an unfamiliar crest. An uneasy prickle ran along Miss Marple's spine at the sight. Somehow, the existence of these objects made the rumours feel more substantial, less like mere village gossip. The medallion had a symbol engraved upon it, a serpentine figure curled around a tarnished shield. Inspector Harris placed it in a sealed bag, expression grim. "We'll have to investigate this crest," he said. "I don't recognize it, and I suspect it's not from around here." Before leaving, Miss Marple glanced once more about the crypt, her gaze lingering on the arching stone ceiling. She felt it important to capture every detail in her mind, the fallen debris, the damp smell, and especially the sense of a clandestine presence that lingered in the air. An indistinct dread weighed heavily in the stillness. Stepping back out into the pale daylight, she took a deep breath. The gloom of the crypt was behind her, yet she suspected its secrets would not be so easily left behind. This was not just a straightforward murder. It felt laced with talk of curses, clandestine rites, and illusions meant to sow fear. And Miss Marple, ever sensitive to human nature, suspected that whoever was behind these dark doings was counting on such fear to cloak their real motive. The rain fell more steadily now, as though the very sky mourned this sinister discovery. Chapter 3. Flickers of Dread. After leaving the dank confines of the crypt, Miss Marple and Reverend Linton followed Inspector Harris across the churchyard, each one lost in their own thoughts. Outside the lich gate, they found a middle-aged woman hovering anxiously beneath a black umbrella. She wore a worried frown and clutched a wicker basket tight against her side. The moment she saw the vicar, she bobbed a hurried curtsy. "Reverend Linton, sir," she said, "I do beg your pardon for waiting, but—" "Ah, Mrs. Bellamy," the vicar greeted her, voice subdued. "This is hardly the place for a chat. Whatever is the matter?" He noticed she looked pale, as if badly shaken. Mrs. Bellamy lowered her eyes. "Well, it's just that my husband Tom saw someone skulking about our side of the lane last night. Dark cloak and all. We're only a stone's throw from the church boundary, and Tom said he heard whispering." She pressed her lips together, trembling slightly. "I couldn't sleep a wink after that. Especially with everything that's happened." Miss Marple examined the woman discreetly. She wore the straightforward attire of a local farmer's wife, and there was an honest ring to her voice. "I dare say you're frightened," she said gently. "But you did the right thing in telling the vicar." Perhaps Tom's recollection might prove quite useful. Inspector Harris broke in. Mrs. Bellamy, your husband should come to the station if he recalls anything specific, height, manner of speech, anything at all. Though he spoke brusquely, there was a note of genuine concern in his tone. Of course, Inspector, she nodded. Then with a bow of her head, she set off back towards the village, leaving the trio to watch her brisk figure vanish into the rain. Reverend Linton drew a heavy sigh. This is affecting everyone, he murmured. Before Lord Petherbridge's death we were quiet folk. Now there's suspicion at every turn. Miss Marple offered a comforting pat on his arm. A murder, especially one cloaked in such mystery, can cast a long shadow, Reverend. The inspector cleared his throat. Indeed, he said, checking his watch. I must return to the station and see if the lab has identified that crest on the medallion. Miss Marple, if you'd like, I can drop you and the vicar off at Petherbridge Hall. I understand the new heir is in residence, along with some of the staff. Might be wise to speak with them. New heir? Miss Marple echoed with interest. I hadn't heard. Yes, replied Inspector Harris. A distant cousin, Mr. Arthur Quimby. Arrived yesterday, apparently. The inheritance is complicated. No one was quite sure who'd take charge of the estate. I suspect he might be able to tell us more about the late Lord's affairs. A grave-faced groundsman admitted them, and they proceeded up a winding drive. The hall came into view, a sprawling manor of grey stone, its windows tall and narrow. In the gloom, the building looked almost sullen, as if resentful of prying eyes. Miss Marple sensed that behind those windows lay secrets not easily coaxed into daylight. They were shown into a vast entrance hall with oak panelling and high ceilings. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bowman, nervous and pale as a ghost, recognized Reverend Linton at once and ushered them towards a drawing room. There they found a man, standing by the fireplace dressed in mourning black. He was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, with a narrow face that looked unsettled yet resolute. Mr. Quimby? Inspector Harris inquired. The man nodded. I'm Inspector Harris, and these are Reverend Linton and Miss Marple. We'd like to ask a few questions about Lord Petherbridge's recent activities. Arthur Quimby offered a curt bow, trying to compose himself. I'll do my best to help, Inspector, he said quietly. Though my cousin and I were never close, I've only just arrived to manage matters, but everything's so strange. No one will give me a straight answer about his final days. Miss Marple, observing him closely, noted the genuine concern in his features. She could see shadows beneath his eyes, telltale signs of sleeplessness or stress. When precisely did you learn you were next in line for the estate? She asked softly. Arthur sighed. Only after the police contacted my solicitors. I was living in London, happily oblivious to all this. I was never fond of my cousin's old place. Heard all sorts of superstitions about it. Curses and crypts, that sort of nonsense. His gaze shifted uneasily as he mentioned the crypt. Before he could continue, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Mrs. Bowman entered, her face drawn with tension. Pardon me, sir, she murmured, eyeing the newcomers warily. But there's a pressing matter, something about the accounts you're needed in the study. Arthur grimaced apologetically. I must attend to this. Inspector Miss Marple, please make yourselves comfortable. Feel free to speak to the staff. Left momentarily alone with Reverend Linton and the inspector, Miss Marple wandered about the spacious room. The silence within the hall felt thick, as though grief and fear had seeped into the very walls. She glanced at the heavily brocaded curtains drawn across the tall windows. Beyond them stretched a view of the estate's gardens, now almost swallowed by encroaching weeds. Lord Petherbridge's demise seemed to have plunged everything into a state of slow decay. "Shall we begin with the staff, Inspector?" she suggested at last, in her mild, purposeful way. Inspector Harris nodded. "We'll have to. Quinby's not much help if he's new here. Let's see what the servants might reveal about the late Lord's final days. Someone knows more than they're admitting, I'm certain of it." Miss Marple stood straight, smoothing the lapel of her coat. She had no illusions about the danger lurking in this dark corner of Devonshire. Yet she also felt that quiet determination that always guided her. She would get to the truth, even if it meant peering into shadows that others dared not face. Chapter 4. Shadows Among the Staff. Once Arthur Quinby left them in the drawing-room, Miss Marple and Reverend Linton exchanged thoughtful glances. Inspector Harris, hands clasped behind his back, was already surveying the faded portraits along the walls as if they might divulge family secrets. But the heavy hush of Petherbridge Hall pressed on them like a fog, thick with unspoken tensions. Mrs. Bowman soon reappeared, bobbing a stiff curtsy in the doorway. "The master will be some time, I'm afraid," she murmured. "He's dealing with certain matters concerning the estate. However, if you'd care to speak with members of the household—" Her voice trailed off uncertainly, as though she feared she might be overstepping her place. Inspector Harris cleared his throat. "We would indeed, Mrs. Bowman. Might we start with you? Your role here must have brought you into Lord Petherbridge's confidence from time to time." The housekeeper's thin lips pursed, and she glanced at Miss Marple with an expression half apprehensive, half relieved. "I'll do what I can, sir," she said, clasping her hands. "Though I can't say I knew much of the master's private affairs. A closed man he was, closed and distant, especially in his final months." Reverend Linton stepped forward gently. "We do understand this is difficult," he said. "But anything you can recall about his demeanour or routine in the days before he died could be of help." Mrs. Bowman nodded slowly. "Well, he was jumpy, nervy, if I might say so, sir. Started pacing at night, muttering about old debts and curses. Yes, curses. It unsettled the rest of us, something dreadful. And then he'd dash off in that motor car of his without a word, or spend hours locked away in his study." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he confide in anyone at all?" she asked. "Perhaps the late lord had a friend he trusted?" A fleeting flicker crossed Mrs. Bowman's face, but she shook her head. "Not that I'm aware of, madam. He often argued with his solicitor over the telephone, Mr. Forbes, in Exeter. Beyond that, I only heard bits and bobs. He was worried about losing money, said he'd be done for if things went wrong." She broke off, twisting her apron in trembling hands. "Please forgive me. Talking about it like this, it makes it all feel real again." Gently, Miss Marple patted the housekeeper's arm. "You're very brave to help us. One more thing, did you ever see anyone lurking about the grounds at night? Perhaps wearing a cloak or carrying candles?" Mrs. Bowman startled, as though Miss Marple had touched on a forbidden subject. Well, only once. About a fortnight before he was found in that dreadful place, I was up late. Thought I'd heard footsteps near the back staircase. Looked out from my window at the staff wing and saw a light flickering among the trees that lead toward the churchyard. I couldn't make out who it was." Inspector Harris exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "Thank you," he said firmly. "That's most useful." Soon after Mrs. Bowman left, another figure appeared at the door. A tall, thin man with greying hair, stooped slightly at the shoulders. His attire, an old-fashioned black coat and worn gloves, suggested he was more accustomed to outdoor work than polishing silver. He introduced himself as Mr. Webb, the caretaker. "You'll be wanting to ask me questions," he said flatly, as though resigned to an interrogation. "I've overseen the house and grounds for nigh on 30 years. Miss Marple gave him a warm smile. "Indeed, Mr. Webb. Please do join us. You must know the estate better than anyone." He nodded, though he remained standing, hat clutched in both hands. "I'll say this. Lord Petherbridge was a proud man and not universally liked. He had disputes with tenants over rent, especially that artist fellow, Mr. Gray, down in the old gardener's cottage." A faint tremor ran through his voice. But his death, that was something else, unnatural. And I'll tell you, he feared something, though I never believed in all that talk of spirits. People claim there's a family curse haunting the crypt, but it's just old folklore. Reverend Linton frowned. "Folklore can sometimes stir real terror, Mr. Webb. Did the late Lord ever speak of any wrongdoing on his part, or mention feeling threatened by someone in the village?" The caretaker hesitated. "Not directly, but once, a few weeks ago, I found him pacing the stables after dark, muttering about treachery in his own house. He spotted me and clammed right up. Next day, he flew into a rage when I mentioned the crypt, warned me never to trespass near it." Miss Marple and the inspector exchanged significant looks. "It does seem, Mr. Webb," she said softly, "that Lord Petherbridge had a rather consuming fear of that crypt. Did you ever see him venture there at night?" The caretaker's face darkened. "Only once that I know of. On the evening before he died, I glimpsed him hurrying down the path at twilight. I was closing the greenhouse shutters and heard his footsteps. When I called out, he didn't answer. The next day I heard—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "That he was found there, and it still keeps me awake, thinking I might have stopped him or whoever—" He broke off, voice unsteady. A solemn hush descended, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Miss Marple reflected that the old walls of Petherbridge Hall seemed steeped in unspoken dread, as though its very stones harboured secrets best left buried. Between Mrs. Bowman's unease, Mr. Webb's cryptic recollections, and the talk of chanting lights in the night, the mystery felt more entangled than ever. Inspector Harris murmured his thanks to the caretaker, who departed with a stiff nod. After a moment, the inspector turned to Miss Marple and the vicar. "It's clear the late lord was terrified of something," he said gravely. "But was it truly something lurking in the crypt? Or could it have been an all-too-human threat?" Miss Marple, her face thoughtful, smoothed the fabric of her cardigan. "Both are possibilities, Inspector. Fear is a powerful weapon indeed. And if the murderer harnessed that fear, well—" She exhaled softly. "We must tread carefully. There's more here than meets the eye." Chapter 5. Whispers in the Night. Miss Marple found herself unable to shake the gloom that seemed to cling to Petherbridge Hall. After her conversations with Mrs. Bowman and Mr. Webb, she and Reverend Linton were shown back through the echoing corridors. Inspector Harris had retreated to speak with Mr. Quinby regarding estate documents, promising to rejoin them afterwards. Left to her own devices, Miss Marple quietly slipped outside. The air beyond the threshold, though damp and cold, felt oddly fresher, an escape from the stuffiness of the old house. The leaden sky overhead gave little comfort. Rain still threatened, and bleak patches of cloud hung low over the horizon. She made her way around the side of the manor and discovered a path leading to the neglected gardens. A battered bench stood near a crumbling fountain. The stone cherub at its centre had lost its head, leaving behind a sad, eroded figure. Miss Marple paused there, listening to the stillness. From behind, a cluster of overgrown rose bushes emerged a figure, tall, dishevelled, with paint-stained fingers. He wore a threadbare jacket and carried a sketch pad under his arm. He halted abruptly upon spotting Miss Marple. She recognised him at once from Reverend Linton's description, Ambrose Gray, the artist, who rented a cottage on the estate. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said gently, her tone kind but observant. Gray eyed her warily before nodding in return. "I believe we share an acquaintance in Reverend Linton. I'm Miss Marple." He appeared torn between politeness and anxiety. "Yes. I've heard you're helping investigate Lord Petherbridge's death. Horrible business." His eyes darted over her shoulder, as though expecting someone else to appear. Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture. "Do you mind if I join you for a moment?" she asked. "I could use some fresh air. This house is so very oppressive right now." Gray gave a feeble shrug, and she took it as permission. They strolled a short way across the uneven gravel. Stopping beside a hedgerow, she gently probed. "Mr. Gray, you were at odds with the late Lord, were you not? Something about a dispute concerning your tenancy." He sighed, his thin face taut. "He wanted me off his land, or so he said. Hinted that my lease was ending. Claimed my painting made no profit. Nothing to bring honour to the estate. That's how he saw everything, in terms of prestige or profit. But," he hesitated, glancing off at the bramble-laced garden, "I had no reason to kill him. I might have loathed his arrogance, but murder, that's another matter." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic tilt of the head. "Of course, conflict doesn't necessarily mean one would commit such an unspeakable act. But do tell me, on the night of his death, were you anywhere near the crypt?" She kept her voice softly inquisitive, the better to invite honest answers. A flicker of alarm crossed Gray's features. "Certainly not," he said too quickly. I was at home, painting. Alone, unfortunately, so I've no alibi. But I swear, Miss Marple, I had no hand in that dreadful affair." He pressed the sketch-pad closer to his chest. "You must believe me." She studied him for a moment, reading the sincerity in his tired eyes. "What about the legends of chanting in the churchyard, or lights flickering after midnight?" she asked. "Have you seen or heard anything of the sort?" Gray looked genuinely unsettled. "I've heard chanting, not clearly, but a low, throbbing sound late at night, as though from a distance. At first, I put it down to my imagination, but then, about a week ago, I glimpsed flickering lights drifting among the tombstones. It lasted only a moment, then vanished. I locked my door and convinced myself it was nonsense. But something is amiss here, Miss Marple. I feel it whenever I step outside." Before she could question him further, footsteps sounded on the gravel, and Inspector Harris rounded the corner. He greeted the artist tersely, then motioned for Miss Marple to join him. Gray retreated swiftly, as though eager to escape the inspector's scrutiny. Harris offered Miss Marple a slight shrug. "Quinby's busy searching for missing financial papers, apparently. Claims there's some confusion over the estate's debts. Meanwhile, Mr. Forbes, Lord Petherbridge's solicitor, has arrived in the village. I'm told he'll meet with us soon. Perhaps we'll get some clarity on the late Lord's affairs." As they walked back toward the imposing front doors, Miss Marple confided in a low tone, "Mr. Gray has heard chanting at night as well. Something intangible seems to link these nocturnal gatherings to Lord Petherbridge's terror. If we find who orchestrated it, we may find our killer." Inspector Harris nodded grimly. "I've a mind to watch the churchyard myself tonight. This creeping sense of dread is rattling the entire village. Someone's behind it, feeding these rumors of curses and ghosts." They paused upon reaching the dark entrance hall. Miss Marple cast one last glance over her shoulder toward the neglected garden path where Mr. Gray had disappeared. The sky grew ever dimmer, as if hastening the arrival of yet another fear-filled night. She could almost feel the presence of secrets hovering in the cold air, swirling around Petherbridge Hall like restless spirits. In a measured voice, she said, "Yes. And if we don't act swiftly, more harm might be done." With that, she and the inspector stepped inside, determined to shine the light of reason into every hidden corner, even as the shadows of suspicion gathered thickly around them, hinting that the darkest revelation was yet to come. Chapter 6. Watchers in the Dark. Miss Marple sat before the fire, knitting needles clacking in a careful rhythm as she pondered all she had learned. Her calm demeanour belied a certain tension in her eyes, the kind that surfaces when one senses the hidden pieces of a puzzle shifting into place. Reverend Linton hovered near the mantel, fidgeting with the clock's key. "I confess, Miss Marple," he said, voice taut, "I hardly know what to think anymore. Our poor villagers speak of cloaked figures drifting through the churchyard. Some claim to have heard that unholy chanting as recently as last night. Inspector Harris seems determined to put an end to these midnight gatherings. He's asked me to join him on watch again, and he hoped you might come too." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "I should be happy to, Reverend," she said. "Such direct observation might help us see who or what has been skulking among the gravestones." She paused briefly, remembering how the crypt's eerie hush had settled into her bones. "Though I must warn you, we must keep very still and very quiet. Sometimes the faintest rustle can send a culprit fleeing." The plan was simple. They would post themselves near the boundary wall with a good vantage across the churchyard. If the mysterious lights appeared, Inspector Harris and his men would move swiftly to catch any intruders in the act. It was a risky endeavour, for no one knew how dangerous these nocturnal visitors might be. Yet Miss Marple believed it necessary. Perhaps this was how they would uncover what truly lay behind Lord Petherbridge's murder. At 11:30 they set out. The vicar, bundled in a long coat, walked beside Miss Marple, who clutched a heavy shawl around her shoulders. A pair of constables followed a few paces behind, their boots squelching on the wet ground. The moon, wan and gibbous, peered intermittently through ragged clouds, throwing patches of silver across the ancient headstones. An owl hooted, its cry echoing through the stillness, making Reverend Linton start. Miss Marple offered him a reassuring nod. Inspector Harris was already waiting by a gnarled yew tree. He motioned them to a sheltered spot against the stone boundary, where the shadows were thickest. "I've stationed 2 men behind the crypt," he whispered. "If anyone comes this way, we'll see them." A tense vigil began. Now and then, the wind carried faint sounds from the village, a dog barking, the distant creak of a barn door. Time stretched, the minutes feeling like hours. Miss Marple, leaning against the cold stone, let her gaze roam across the graves, half expecting to see a bobbing lantern or glimmer of candlelight. Just as the night seemed poised to remain uneventful, a flicker of movement caught her eye. She touched Inspector Harris's sleeve, heart thudding. Across the churchyard, near the far corner by a row of squat tombstones, a faint glow flickered behind a cluster of ivy. It was small, like a candle struggling against the wind. The inspector stiffened, signalling for silence. Everyone watched as the wavering light slowly drifted closer, revealing 2 dark figures in hooded cloaks. Miss Marple felt an involuntary tremor of unease. Even from a distance, the shapes seemed eerie, gliding noiselessly across the grass. Then the taller of the 2 raised an arm as if in command. The smaller figure bent down, placing something on the ground, a candle, perhaps. At that moment, a soft chanting began, carried on the breeze in snatches of unintelligible words. Reverend Linton's face went pale. Miss Marple's nerves jangled, but she kept her composure. She could sense how crucial it was to observe every detail. The chanting grew slightly louder, a low, monotonous murmur that made the hair on the back of her neck prickle. Inspector Harris gestured to the constables, indicating it was time to close in. They crept forward, taking advantage of each patch of darkness. Miss Marple and the vicar hung back, not wishing to interfere with the arrest. The hooded pair appeared too absorbed in their ritual to notice. As the inspector's men fanned out, Miss Marple fully expected them to leap up and seize the shadowy intruders. By the time Inspector Harris reached the spot, all that remained were footprints in the damp grass and a few melted droplets of wax. The chanting had abruptly ceased, leaving the graveyard in an oppressive hush, broken only by the inspector's frustrated curse. The hooded pair had melted into the night as swiftly as they had appeared. Shaken, Reverend Linton joined Miss Marple at the edge of the scene. She bent down, examining the wax remains with her small torch. Nearby lay a shard of something metal, as if a pendant or brooch had been dropped in the commotion. She carefully slipped it into her handbag. It bore a partial engraving of the same curious crest Inspector Harris had found before. Something serpentine, though the rest was too damaged to identify clearly. Inspector Harris blew out a breath, his anger barely contained. "They're more cunning than I'd hoped," he muttered. "But at least we've got more evidence. Next time, I vow they won't be so lucky." Miss Marple straightened, gazing around at the silent graves. A chill seeped into her bones, though whether from the cold or the night's events she could not say. Whoever these watchers were, their ritual was no mere prank. She feared that the real danger might yet lie ahead, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to strike again. Chapter 7. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The following morning, Miss Marple rose early, determined to press on with her inquiries. Inspector Harris had departed at first light to meet with the local constabulary, his frustration from the thwarted stakeout still fresh in his mind. For her part, Miss Marple could not forget the low, eerie chanting or the hooded figures that had vanished into the dark. She felt their presence still hanging in the damp air. Downstairs in the Vicarage's cosy breakfast room, Reverend Linton stood by the window, frowning at a letter in his hand. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "this arrived under the door just now." "It's unsigned." He passed over a sheet of paper on which a single message had been scrawled in a rough hand. "Stay away from the crypt, or you'll join Lord Petherbridge below." Miss Marple read it without outward shock, though her heart beat faster. "A crude threat meant to deter us," she observed, voice calm. "Which likely means we're getting close to something, or someone, very desperate." Over a simple breakfast of buttered toast and weak tea, the two discussed their next steps. The partial crest Miss Marple had retrieved from the churchyard warranted further study. Inspector Harris had already rushed the fragment to the station for examination, but Miss Marple's own curiosity urged a different path. She was determined to learn more of the Petherbridge family's history, and so asked the vicar if there were any old church records or genealogies she might peruse. Reverend Linton brightened a little at the request. "We do have a small parish archive," he said. "Old ledgers, registers of births and deaths, even some family records from the local gentry. It's kept in a locked cabinet at the back of the vestry. I'd be only too glad to fetch them for you." Within the hour, Miss Marple found herself in the hushed confines of the vestry, where the smell of wax, polish and incense mingled with the faint must of ancient parchment. Reverend Linton brought out a stack of fragile tomes and manuscripts. Pages cracked under gentle fingers as she leafed through records dating back centuries. Amid dusty genealogical charts, she discovered references to an ancestor of the Petherbridge line, a notorious figure rumoured to have dabbled in the occult art. A few lines mentioned a secret society that once met by candlelight in the environs of the old crypt centuries ago. "Superstitious nonsense, perhaps," Reverend Linton murmured, peering over her shoulder. "Still, I see how such legends might fuel the current rumours." Miss Marple nodded, lips pursed. She suspected the truth lay in something more practical, like blackmail or hidden debts, but understood how real fear could arise from half-remembered tales. Emerging from the vestry, they encountered Arthur Quinby, who had come to speak with the vicar about certain church donations once pledged by Lord Petherbridge. He appeared tense, as though carrying a weight he could scarcely manage. "Vicar," he said quietly, "it's worse than I imagined. The accounts are a shambles riddled with unexplained withdrawals, and I've discovered letters suggesting that my cousin was desperate for funds to clear private debts." He glanced uneasily at Miss Marple. "I can't help wondering whether someone used those debts to gain power over him." She considered him for a moment. "Forgive me if this sounds intrusive, Mr. Quinby, but do you think these mysterious letters might be connected to the threats we've witnessed in the churchyard? Perhaps the late Lord was compelled to perform some bizarre ritual or else face public ruin." Quinby swallowed hard, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's not beyond possibility. The staff whisper about blackmail, though they offer no names, and the solicitor, Mr. Forbes, is suspiciously tight-lipped. He's visiting again this afternoon. I should like you or Inspector Harris to speak with him." They parted ways, leaving Miss Marple all the more convinced that the nighttime chanting was a cloak for something quite mortal, a scheme rooted in greed, power, and fear. She could not shake the feeling that someone in the village or the estate was deliberately conjuring these hauntings to hide a far more conventional misdeed. Later that day, she joined Inspector Harris at Petherbridge Hall once more. A black motor car sat parked in the circular drive, indicating Mr. Forbes's arrival. Inside, they found the solicitor standing in the entry hall, his polished shoes tapping impatiently on the marble floor. He was a trim man with a high forehead, carrying a leather briefcase. "Inspector?" he greeted stiffly, eyes flicking to Miss Marple with guarded curiosity. "I was sent for. I presume this concerns the estate's finances and the circumstances of Lord Petherbridge's death?" Inspector Harris nodded, lips set in a thin line. "Precisely. We have reason to believe Lord Petherbridge was involved in some clandestine matters. You, as his solicitor, might shed light on it. We found evidence of new beneficiaries in his will. Care to explain?" A flicker of discomfort passed over Forbes's face. "I can't discuss client business without cause, Inspector. But if you must know, the late Lord made certain changes referencing a group or fund I'd never heard of, something called Renford. I advised caution, but he was insistent." The solicitor's voice trailed off as though aware he might be revealing too much. "If you want details, you'll need a proper warrant." Miss Marple quietly studied Forbes. His rigid stance and quick darting glances suggested he was concealing more than mere professional secrets. Yet she also sensed genuine uncertainty in him, as though he'd become embroiled in something he could not fully control. Inspector Harris frowned, but did not press further, at least not yet. As Forbes made a polite excuse and retreated toward the study, Miss Marple cast a long look around the hall's shadowed corners. The echoes of chanting and the hooded figures still reverberated in her mind, intertwined now with the revelations about dubious beneficiaries and pressing debts. The atmosphere crackled with tension, as though Petherbridge Hall itself braced for some final upheaval. Outside, the rain intensified, spattering against the tall windows. Miss Marple pursed her lips as she listened to it drumming on the glass. She was certain that very soon the veils of secrecy would be torn aside. One question remained: would the truth emerge before another life was lost to the darkness enfolding this cursed estate? Chapter 8. The Unveiling of Shadows. The tension at Petherbridge Hall was palpable as a storm brewed outside, casting erratic shadows through the stained glass windows. Inside, Miss Marple, Inspector Harris, Reverend Linton, and Arthur Quinby convened in the dimly lit library. The group gathered around a large oak table strewn with various documents, letters, legal papers, and the cryptic warnings that had been so mysteriously delivered. Arthur Quinby, looking more haggard by the hour, passed a trembling hand through his hair. "I've unearthed something quite unsettling," he began, his voice strained, as he handed a yellowed sheet of paper to Inspector Harris. "It appears my cousin had been blackmailed for months over some scandalous family secret, linked somehow to the crypt." Inspector Harris examined the document, a brow arched skeptically. "This suggests a significant motive for murder, Mr. Quinby. Do you know who might have been behind this?" Quinby shook his head. "Only that it must be someone with deep knowledge of our family's history. The notes mentioned the sins of the past and were explicit about the consequences of non-compliance." Miss Marple interjected softly, her eyes thoughtful. "The crypt, the supposed rituals, and now blackmail. It paints a rather grim picture, does it not? It seems someone used Lord Petherbridge's fear of the family curse to manipulate him." The group fell silent, pondering her words. It was Reverend Linton who broke the quiet. "I believe we should confront this head-on," he suggested. "Tonight we hold a vigil at the crypt. If this ritual is indeed a cover for something more sinister, it may be our only chance to catch the orchestrator red-handed." Miss Marple nodded in agreement. "A sound plan, Reverend, and perhaps a bit of a trap might help us flush out the culprit." As night descended, the storm outside peaked, the wind howling like the wails of the damned, adding to the gothic atmosphere of their grim undertaking. Equipped with lanterns and steeled by a grim determination, the group made their way to the ancient churchyard. They positioned themselves strategically, hidden amongst the gnarled yew trees that stood like silent sentinels around the perimeter of the crypt. The hours passed heavily. The only sounds, the relentless pelting of rain and the creaking of ancient branches. Then, just as the clock in the village struck midnight, a figure cloaked in black emerged from the shadows, moving towards the crypt with a hurried, almost frantic pace. Inspector Harris tensed, ready to spring forward, but Miss Marple touched his arm lightly, signaling him to wait. They watched as the figure reached the crypt, glancing nervously around before producing a key and entering. Moments later, a dim light flickered within. "Now," whispered Miss Marple, and the group surged forward, reaching the crypt as the door swung shut. Inspector Harris kicked the door open with a forceful push. Inside they found not a gathering of cultists, but a solitary figure. Mr. Forbes, the solicitor, his face ghostly pale in the lantern light. Around him were scattered ancient documents and a small open safe embedded in the crypt wall. "What on earth?" gasped Reverend Linton. Forbes, caught in the act, slumped defeated. "I was only retrieving what was rightfully mine," he confessed, his voice trembling. "The blackmail was a ruse, fabricated by me to pressure Lord Petherbridge into securing my inheritance. The Renford Fund, it was all a sham, designed to funnel money from the estate to cover my debts." Inspector Harris handcuffed him with a clink of finality. "You exploited his superstitions, manipulated his fear of the old family curse to drive him to despair," he said sternly. Miss Marple nodded sagely. "And the so-called rituals? Were they also your doing, Mr. Forbes?" He nodded miserably. "A mere theatric, to keep the locals away, and to perpetuate the myth I needed to shield my activities." As they led Forbes away, Reverend Linton looked at Miss Marple with profound respect. "Once again, Miss Marple, you've cut through the shadows to reveal the truth." She smiled, adjusting her hat against the rain. "Human nature is quite predictable, Reverend. Fear and greed often lead to folly. It's always the quiet ones, the details observed when one thinks nobody is watching, that reveal the most, Back at the vicarage, as they dried off and warmed themselves by the fire, Miss Marple reflected on the case. The storm had passed, leaving a clear sky punctuated by the twinkling of stars. It seemed a fitting metaphor for the resolution of the mystery, darkness dispelled by the light of truth. Evil thrives in shadows, she mused aloud, but even the darkest night must yield to dawn.